care if they lay me off either, because I told Bill that if they move my desk one more time, then I'm quitting. I'm going to quit. And I told Dom too, because they've moved my desk 4 times already this year, and I used to be over by the window and I could see the squirrels, and they were married, but then they switched. See?
Hi, Milton.
But
What's happening?
I was said
Milt,
that,
we're going to need to go ahead and move you downstairs into storage B.
no, I was told I
have
could not.
some new people
If,
coming in,
no,
and we need all the
there's,
space we can get.
but there's no space.
So if you could
in,
just go ahead and
if,
pack up your
it,
stuff
it,
and move it down there,
but no,
that would be terrific.
I was told I
Okay?
could stay. Excuse me. I believe you have my stapler.
Milton,
Yes,
what's happening?
I wanted to speak to
Say,
you.
Milton, you know what would be great?
But no,
Since you're down here, it would be really great if you could just sort of
Take care of the cockroach problem we've been having in here.
no, that's really not my job, and I haven't received my paycheck this week.
For now, why don't you go ahead and get yourself a flashlight and a can of pesticide and...
Excuse me. Excuse me. But okay, but that's the last straw.
Okay, if you have ever experienced anything similar to that, I'd like you to talk to Mr. Ross straight away, because we need to talk about your workplace. Hello, welcome to the second video of our Alienation podcast. And we are going to look at 3 forms of alienation that would relate very much to that video and other videos that I've put on the interactive map, okay? Need to make something really clear. We won't watch these videos in the interactive map. We'll probably watch them in class, but, and this is really important, you have access to them at any time and you can watch them whenever you like, okay? All these videos relate to some kind of alienation that we're discussing today. So we're going to study how Marx argued that in capitalism, the work we do is alienated from us. That's really important. You kind of believe that in a capitalist society, our labor, our work, things that we do for a living tend to confront us, tend to be set against us. It's not something that we work with in order to live a fulfilling life. So in order to achieve this big goal, we need to name, define, and interrelate key terms so we can then form useful premises that will then be able to generate arguments. Once we've generated, had a look at these arguments, we'll understand the philosophy much more deeply, and then we'll be able to articulate 3 different types of alienation and how they are related to each other. And more importantly, once we've looked at these 3 different types of alienation, we'll be able to really think about, in an existential, probably spiritual would be a better way of putting it, how these forms of alienation affect us. Because remember, even though it might come across as we're studying dry economics, there is a deep sense of tragedy to this philosophy in the fact that we spend our lives working, and as we spend our lives working, we give that life over to something that confronts us, which is our work, something we hate. And that's a real tragedy because, according to Marx, you only get one life. So can you please write down the 3 success criteria in front of you and then score yourself out of 4, and then we'll move on. Okay, if you haven't done so already, could you pretty please, with the cherry on top, write down that the 3 types of alienation we're going to look at are basically alienation from time, alienation from the work that we do, or alienated labor, and alienation from the commodities or the products of our labor. Okay. Alrighty, this old mind map, this big old mind map is much more complex, but it's a more complicated version of something we've already looked at. This is the CEO of Gucci. He is not really the shareholder that owns all of Gucci, but he probably has some shares, and he is an owner of Gucci. And one thing we need to make really, really clear is we're not talking about the CEO. We're talking about the people who actually own the shares of the business, okay? Not the workers of the business, but the people who own the business. And in a share-based company, people who own shares are people who own the business. They're the capitalists that we're talking about. And usually what happens is the CEO of the company is rewarded in some form of stocks, so they get shares in the company, right? And they have lots and lots of money, and they invest in the company, and because they invest in the company has money, which is a form of capital, to buy other capital. And that other capital would be the place that you work, the resources that you need to produce commodities, the energy that you need to produce the commodities, and the money required to pay for the wages of people who produce those commodities. Sounds familiar? So it should. And that's what our factory looks like. Now, we all know that Gucci, it's much more complex. Gucci has a supply chain. It doesn't directly employ the people working here. Basically, he contracts the work out to a middleman who contracts the work out to another middleman, and then they end up employing somebody somewhere in a developing nation to produce the fabric for them. But this guy, if anything, he's the one who employs the designers who work at the top of the company. And we're really looking at a series or a chain of many different companies working together. But if you simplify it, you get this kind of relationship. All right, take some notes. All right, and obviously the workers produce the material, but so do the designers, so do the people who actually assemble the garments, and all the other workers come together and they produce the commodity or the Gucci product that is on sale. That product is then converted into cash. The profit pours directly through to Gucci, and then they pay out the shareholders. In this case, I'm assuming that the CEO is a shareholder, okay? And that then allows us to have more money, and more money means we can then purchase more capital, which means that we can then employ more workers. Work is our capital, which then means we can produce more commodities, and we can convert those commodities into money. Of course, there's always a profit, and that gets paid out to the shareholders, but some of that profit also goes back into reproducing capital, and the cycle continues, all right? In this case, we need to remember that capital is anything that can be used to reproduce more capital. Capital is the means of production, and the means of production are money, work, resources, factories, infrastructure, all this stuff that can come together to help us reproduce the capital we've already got. And primarily capital is reproduced once a commodity is produced and then sold for a profit, and that profit is owned by the business owner. In most cases, that's the shareholder or the person who owns the stocks in the company. Okay? You do have proprietary limited companies, you do have small businesses which have a different ownership structure. And at the time that Marx was writing, because it was a really primitive stage of capitalism that he was writing at, mainly he thought that people would own the businesses directly, but in modern capitalism, the ownership structures are much more complex. But still, once we understand that even if that's the case, people have some people have 25% of a company and then 25% of another company, the cycle still really applies, all right? We look at an impersonal and external system that is all about how we produce goods and services. Goods and services must be profitable and profitable enough for the shareholder, the business owner, the capitalist, to then be able to reproduce more capital and then go through the cycle. Now, if he doesn't produce to reproduce more capital, what likely will happen is that the other people who are producing more capital will buy him out and he'll just stop existing. So there's this competition to stay relevant, which means that you have to maximize your profits and increase your business and increase your market share, because someone else will be able to do a better job because they'll have more capital if you don't do it. Okay? Take a note. Now that really does sound like boring, dry economics, but it is the economic cycle which determines how you, me, and many of the ones that we love and care about give, according to the law, approximately 1/3 of our lives away. Okay? That's why I put this really big comment here. Because really, from a Marxist point of view, this worker is embodying their time and their self in the product. Now, if you think about it, the only reason why we pay for this garment is because it's got labor embedded into it. It's got intellectual property from the designers. It's got marketing, of course, embodied in it, which is a form of labor. But it's also got the labor of the people who actually produced it embodied in it. It's got the labor of the people who transported it. All these things would not just happen naturally. And we don't purchase air because there is no labor involved in bringing air to our noses, okay? So the reason why we pay for this product is because it's got some kind of labor embodied into it. Some work needed to be done to get it to you, and that is why it has some kind of social value. Because if it just came to you naturally and no work was required in getting it, then you wouldn't have to pay for it, okay? And that means that this dress is partly a an embodiment of all the lives of people that have come together to produce it. Take a note. So really our lives are poured into the products we produce. Okay, and that's why I put life right here. Now, where's the sense of tragedy in this? Well, the sense of tragedy is in the fact that we live in an impersonal and external system that doesn't really care about how we want to embody our lives in material products of the outside world. It doesn't really care about how we want to express our actual lives in the outside world. It cares about making sure that this cycle continues to enact itself, right? And the first consequence of that is that we then end up alienating ourselves from the time we spend living. Now, theoretically, we should be, though there's a lot of unpaid overtime in Australia, we should be working for an 8-hour day and sleeping for 8 hours and having some kind of recreation for another 8. Play, work, sleep. Big, huge revolution happened around the Industrial Revolution time, where we all said, look, it is time that we divided the day up equally so we can have a quality of life. We want to be able to work, play and enjoy ourselves, and sleep. And that's why we had Labor Day to celebrate the coming to that realization that we need to divide the day up into equal thirds. But this 1/3 that we're supposed to work for is kind of poured into work that's very much like what we saw on 15 million credits. It's not fulfilling. You just do it in order to earn an external reward, which is money, and you pedal away and you give literally 1/3 of your life away, and then you die. There's nothing afterwards, okay? So the point is that this time that we spend doing this work is completely separate from us. It confronts us. It's not something we really want to do. We're compelled to do it because we must earn money, okay? And because we're compelled to do it and we want to do the money, we don't really find fulfillment in it and we're alienated from the time. The time becomes separate to us and the time we spend working becomes confronting to us. So take a note. So logically, it follows then that if you're alienated from the time you spend working, well, then you're probably going to be alienated from the work that you spend during that time or the work you do during that time. And remember, as an atheist and a materialist, Marx believed that who you are is yourself over the time that you live. And quite literally, when you work, you are embodying your life into the products that you create. You are spending that time and you are using your material existence in that time to produce something. Work is an expression of you. Take a note. But, of course, in a capitalist workplace, you don't work to fulfill yourself, you work to be paid, and the goods and things that are being produced are determined by the logic of the market. Okay? And in the process of it being determined by the market, it loses any kind of intrinsic value. And you automatically start hating your work because you're not producing anything for spiritual or existential fulfillment. So your work becomes confronting. It's something you do because it's being controlled by an impersonal Frankenstein that is the capitalist cycle we talked about above. Take a note. Now, Marx wasn't also concerned with alienation. He was also concerned with exploitation. And he said the one good thing about capitalism in terms of exploitation is inevitably there will be times when the supply of labor runs out. And that puts workers in a unique condition to demand higher wages. So think about it. If there's only one packet of chips on the shelf, but there's lots of money around, all of a sudden that price of chips is going to inflate because it'll go to the person with the highest amount of cash. Well, the same goes with work. If supply here is really low, but demand is really high, the workers are in a condition are in a position to demand really, really high wages. And this is still in a major assumption of economics. It's reflected by a lot of Keynesian economics, and some classical economics really does believe in this. So some of the right-wing economics does believe in this as well. So when labour supply is short, then that means wages should increase and inflate. And there's lots of economic theory around that. But workers are in a position to demand a high share of what's produced in society because they have higher wages. The thing about that, though, is that in capitalism, remember, it's very, very good at being able to flexibly invest in any other forms of capital, including machinery. And we have the rise of the machines. So the second that labour becomes expensive, according to Marx, is the second that there's a push towards automation. And that automation isn't like having this robot here, the Terminator robot, who can do almost anything. It's about usually automating workstations. So what used to happen in cottage industries was that a person who was responsible for spinning the yarn would also do the knitting and would also sew the garment together and would have a variety of different jobs and would have the capacity to actually master that labor over a variety of different jobs. But in a capitalist workplace, especially as that particular market or industry starts to mature, people end up being people end up being divided into workstations. And this is a principle that we call division of labor. And as division of labor occurs, the process of producing a good or service becomes easier to automate because it's easier to make a machine that just spins the cloth and have one person supervise that machine. Then it's easier afterwards to have another person automate the machine that sews the cloth together. And instead of needing a lot of people to produce these things, you've got one machine and only one machine that does the work of 10 men and one person who, instead of doing something that was pretty complex because they had 5 different jobs to do, that person only has one job to do. Adam Smith, who was a right-wing economist but still a very good economist, talks about this a lot in his work. And Adam Smith is an economist who is loved by the right, and you might want to look him up. And he talks about the same principle. So the division of labour is built into the automation process of capitalism, and you need to take a note. Right, and one thing that should appear to be really, really, really obvious for you is that when you look at workers in factories where labour is divided up into very segmented steps, like this, people are almost robotic in their actions. And their work is quite menial. In fact, what they're producing is not art, right? It's boring, it's bleak, and they've lost control. In fact, basically, these hands represent not the capitalist, because the capitalist, let's not forget, is also subject to the same rules of capitalism as well. But they give themselves away to this great impersonal system and the logic that commands that you must automate. And also, we must remember too that once we start automating and we make a machine do the work of 10 men while one person works at this really simplified station of work, your wages go back down. And that's what he was saying about exploitation. Basically, after the period where labour becomes in short supply, it'll go back into really big supply again. So keep that in mind. Time to take some notes. And so as a result, we don't find meaning in work. In fact, work becomes alien to us. It confronts us as this horrible monster. You know, if you've watched Prometheus, you realize that the story of Prometheus is very much like Frankenstein. People were meddling in things that they don't really know and ended up creating the xenomorphs that end up attacking humanity again, all right? So that's something to take note of. And instead, you know, because like we see value and we see anything rewarding as something external to our labor, we find meaning in shopping, in acquiring material possessions. And we, in a sense, stop focusing on that one third of our life and the work that we do during that one third of our life as a source of fulfillment. Shopping fulfills us, not working. Take a note. So the last thing to talk about then is if our work is confronting to us like some kind of alien monster, and let me say that I think for most people it is. You never really hear people talk positively about the work that they do. And remember, that's because of the fact that it is controlled by an impersonal system that doesn't care about your intrinsic motivation for work. It does not care. It's all about the reproduction of capital. And because it's all about the reproduction of capital, it has no sympathy for what you find fulfilling. You must do it in order to produce the profitable product that can be bought and sold in the marketplace. And you know, go out and have a chat with people. I think it is very rare to find people who like their work, except for me. I have to admit, I quite like being a teacher. I think it's fantastic. I do it for intrinsic value, as well as extrinsic value as well. I need to feed a family. But I mean, you know, obviously, then the products that you produce are the result of this alienating work. So you're not going to like them. And not only that, too, they're the result of the logic of an impersonal system. You produce what is profitable, not what you would like to produce. Okay. So, I mean, you could argue that this Gucci product is lovely, and there probably is a lot of really lovely, well thought out work, but the primary mode of production for that piece of work, which is the Gucci dress, is not necessarily because you loved it, it's because it's been market researched, focus group tested, and you know it's been designed not from an artistic point of view but from the point of view of what is going to be the most profitable. Now sometimes those two can merge, there's no doubt about it. There is a lot of artistic endeavor in the marketplace, but that's not the number one dominant aim or the number one dominant motivating force. You could be artistic and highly innovative, but if the market doesn't want it, well, you're not going to make money and you're not going to be successful. So, you know, that loss of innovation is there. And that's something to really consider. So, you know, the products of our labor become alienating from us. They're not products that are designed to help us spiritually fulfill what we want to do. They're not an embodiment of ourselves. Remember, that's what Marx thought. Labor, a material concrete commodity, is nothing but an embodiment of ourselves and our expression because we put our work into it. It is something which is dictated by the needs of the market. And, you know, this is where he starts saying it's not just the worker who's alienated, the CEO is too. Because they don't find fulfillment in pursuing their artistic or intellectual endeavors. The bourgeoisie, the capitalist, are also slaves to a system that requires them to not care about their own intrinsic value or intrinsic sense of self. They must work so that they can fulfill what the market needs. Now, let's not be complex about this. I mean, let's not be simple about this. The two do overlap, but also the two do diverge over time. It all depends where the culture is at that particular point of view, right? But I would dare say too, for the most people aren't CEOs, so they don't get to create this great, fantastic Tesla factory like Elon Musk does. And I still say that even though Elon Musk probably has more of a chance to actualize himself through his own work, it's probably compromised as well. He's probably doing things that aren't exactly the way that he would want to do or aren't exactly 100% an expression of himself because he still needs to meet the needs of the market. Okay. So the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the capitalist and the worker, are alienated from the products of their labor. And one thing he points out too is even though we're alienated from the products of labor because they're not exactly our artistic expression, they're what the market requires, we kind of worship them because we hate our labor. Remember, we live to shop? I'm going to give you a moment to take some notes now. Actually, probably should do that. So if we live to shop, you know, we're going to look to and understand that things that have money probably we associate with having value because we're always compelled to work for extrinsic reward. But we also tend to think that these commodities are not the product of our labor. We tend to think that the commodities have some kind of life force in and of themselves. First things first, Marx would argue that the sole source of wealth and value comes from our ability to work together as a society and produce goods and services. That's where value and wealth really come from. And we lose sight of that because we see these things being produced according to the needs of an impersonal system, not according to what the individual wants or what society may want, because sometimes what's profitable isn't exactly what society wants. So we do worship commodities because remember, commodities are things that we buy after we work. And there used to be there's in a lot of earlier religions, there used to be an assumption that every object had some kind of life force within it. And this type of religion was called animism. And animism kind of acquired a bit of a pejorative and judgmental term from the Victorian times that Marx was growing up in, and that Marx was obviously dying in, of course. It was called like a fetishism, and the way anthropologists would explain their religion was that objects would be fetishized, and by that they meant worshipped. So you'd see a tree, and this tree would have the spirit of our ancestors in it, and it would be worshipped as if it had some kind of life force. And Marx thought this was absurd because he was some kind of ultra keen rationalist, empirical rationalist and philosopher. And it's just absurd to assume that any kind of object could have life force within it. That's just dumb. But also, people who were part of the monotheistic religions, like Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims, all these people had the same assumption because they followed a transcendental monotheistic God that didn't live in the earth. So they thought it was equally as backward. So fetishism was seen as a really negative term. And what Marx noticed, and we see this so much with brand logic, guys, it's just so funny. And the latest marketing terms that you just have to listen to, go do your research, listen to podcasts. This is all over the place, right? But what we see is this thing called commodity fetishism, which is where we ascribe to these objects, which are nothing but the products of human labor, but we ascribe to these things a life of their own. And if you don't believe me, have a look at the marketing strategies of Apple. Apple will tell you, we don't sell you just a computer, we sell you a lifestyle. We sell you a set of belief systems, some things that you can believe in. And Nike would say the same. And all the major brands would do this. And the second that you do that is the second that you ascribe a spirit, a something else, to something which is nothing but the product of human interaction and society. You're fetishizing, you're worshipping the commodity. And that, in turn, is just another expression of how we are alienated from the products of our labor. Take a note. It's funny, I keep saying that Metallica is my favorite band, but I guess I kind of contradict myself when I was reading, because a person needs to be open to all philosophy and all different points of views and critical of the ones that they know. I do know a bit about Marx, so it's important that I'm critical of it and I analyze it for its flaws. So I was reading some marketing research to try and see what other people had to say, and I came across this piece of marketing done by Metallica, and they were losing sales of their goods that they would sell outside concerts because they used a different logo. And what they found was when they went back to an old logo, they increased their sales of their products. And that's because people had identified with a different logo. They had kind of ascribed to it this kind of old-fashioned, authentic metal approach, which was lost during the new albums, right? And when you think about it, that logo, that symbolizes that amount of meaning, that amount of essence. But really, what is it? It's just a brand. It's just a product of human labor and human interaction. And that, again, is another example of commodity fetishism, which is the ultimate result of being alienated from the products that you create because you no longer see them as products of your work and society's work. All right, so have we named, defined, and interrelated key terms and developed useful premises to form arguments? Absolutely. You should be full of lots of words. You should understand how we come to the conclusions that we came to through those words and through the premises they create. Did we look at alienation from time, alienation from work, and alienation from the commodities that we produce? Absolutely. And we threw in an extra concept there, which is called commodity fetishism. Have we talked about the existential consequences of this? Yes, we have, right? One thing you should really take out of what Marx was saying is that if you are an atheist, if you are a materialist, you are a material being that exists over time, and you express yourself and your creativity through the work that you do. When you don't have control over that work, you don't have control of your life, and you don't have control of your authenticity. And that is a form, well, that's just a massive, massive tragedy. And the aim is to get back that control. You need to get back that control. Otherwise, you've lost half of yourself. You alienate yourself from yourself. And that is why it's important to consider that this isn't just dry, boring economics. This is a material philosophy which is trying to analyze a spiritual kind of concern, which is who are we? And in his case, he's saying we're a material human being that exists over time and has the capacity to create. And what happens to who we are? Well, it gets separated from us. Our lives get taken away from ourselves and given to this impersonal thing that doesn't really care about how we spend our life. And then, of course, why do we give into consumerism? Well, it's the only way out. So I hope you enjoyed this little presentation. There'll be another coming up. Cheers.